gosh. This is Major Szczepanski. He is an incredible man. Please come out here so they can see how cute you are. He is not 18 years old. I swear to God, this is a grown man. I know he hears that all the time, but it's hard. Anyway, the Major is the commander of the 366 Component Maintenance Squadron, the 366 Maintenance Wing, and the 366 Fighter Wing, Mountain Home Air Force Base. That is the same wing that I was so honored to be the honorary commander of for 2 years, and that's how I met the Major when he first moved to Idaho. He's a native of Buffalo, New York. He was commissioned in 2002 as a distinguished graduate of the Air Force ROTC program at Cornell University. He has served on 2 combat command staffs while assigned to embassy duties in Europe and the Middle East. He is also a regional affairs strategist for the European region. The assignments that he's had over these years included Elgin Air Force Base in Florida, McGuire Air Force Base in New Jersey, Washington, D.C., the U.S. Embassy in Warsaw, Poland, at Luke Air Force Base in Arizona, the U.S. Embassy in Baghdad, Iraq, and now in 2014 he was transferred to Mountain Home Air Force Base here in Idaho, and we're so lucky to have him. His major awards and decorations, I think these are very important. I'm going to need some oxygen. Anybody have any with them? Take a big breath, because there are so many. Defense Meritus Service Medal, Meritus Service Medal, Joint Service Commendation Medal, Air Force Commendation Medal with 2 oak leaf clusters, Joint Service Achievement Medal, National Defense Service Medal, Global War on Terrorism Expeditionary Medal, Global War on Terrorism Service Medal. Today he's going to talk about Operation Atlantic Resolve. That's the DoD's response to the Ukraine crisis, and how the Air Force was tapped to provide reassurance to our NATO allies early in the Ukraine crisis in 2014. So I am so proud to introduce to you, he said I can call him Ski, so I don't use a malapropism and really screw up his name. So he's called Ski. Anyway, thank you so much, sir. We're honored to have you here.
All right, Sue, thank you very much for those kind words and that introduction. It's my great pleasure to be here today. Can everyone hear me in the back? Okay, outstanding. My great pleasure to be here. First of all, a couple of thanks. First, thanks to Sue for the invitation to come and speak. For the last year and a half that I've been stationed at Mountain Home, I've known Sue and have gotten to participate in several events here at the museum, and I've brought some of our young airmen, some of our 18 and 19-year-olds out here to learn about their heritage and our heritage service that we have as service members, and that's been a great opportunity. I also want to thank all the veterans out in the crowd today. As someone who, we're going to talk a little bit, unfortunately, kind of a Cold War topic. Someone who was born in 1980. My generation really owes a debt of gratitude to many of you who stood vigil during the Cold War and made sure that we succeeded and that we are where we are today. Unfortunately, we've got that turns me to today's topic, a little bit of a new Cold War in some respects that is going on in Europe. Want to preference that I'm going to give you my opinions and my thoughts, so some of those might not be those of the United States Air Force, so let me just preference that. And I look forward to trying to answer any questions that you might have when we get through with the slides. So a lot of what I'm going to talk about today is based upon my experience serving in Europe. Had the great opportunity to serve as what we call a security cooperation officer in our U.S. Embassy in Warsaw, Poland. What I did there was work with the Polish government, which has been a NATO member since 1999, a member of the European Union since 2004, on foreign military sales. So that is when a foreign government purchases aircraft or military hardware from the U.S. In their case, they purchased F-16 aircraft from Lockheed. They have 3 squadrons of 48 aircraft. Worked that program, also worked their C-130 Hercules transport program. And while I was in Europe, was very fortunate to get to travel quite a bit and to visit some of these countries that we're going to talk about today. So without further ado, get into the presentation. Okay, just a little bit of what I'll talk about, a little bit of the timeline of what happened in the 2013 timeframe to present with Ukraine. The U.S. European Command and U.S. Air Forces in Europe, resources in response to that, and then talk a little bit about what we might see in the future. Okay, just to review a little bit of the timeline. This really came to the forefront in the fall of 2013 with what we remember as the Maidan protests in Kiev in Ukraine. And that is when a lot of us saw on television images such as this of young Ukrainians out there braving the weather on a day probably very similar to the temperatures that we have outside to protest President Yanukovych, who was the president of Ukraine at the time, him dropping Ukrainian participation in what we call the Eastern Partnership, which was the European Union's effort to establish deeper ties with Ukraine, whether those be trade, whether those be security, travel links, etc. And they were upset because they saw their future in Europe. They saw themselves as Europeans. And that was upsetting to the Putin government because he saw another country slipping from the Russian orbit closer to Western Europe, closer to our NATO member countries. So we saw those protests begin in November of 2013. And those intensified as time went on. There were some unfortunate incidents where both Ukrainian police officers and protesters were killed. It did become violent. And on the 27th of February 2014, President Yanukovych left. And he fled to Russia, where he still, we believe, is. After that, a lot came out, a lot was discovered in the government archives of just how much of the national treasure that the Yanukovych regime had taken from the country. And people actually got to go and walk into his private villa outside of Kiev, and was very surprised to see all the gilded hardware and the gilded tables and chairs and the private automobile collection that really, to the average Ukrainian with their standard of living, was very quite shocking. Then we saw on the 1st of March 2014, we saw troops in Ukraine. And it was very unclear who those troops were. 7 April, then we saw the conflict move into the eastern portion of Ukraine, into Donetsk, Luhansk, and Kharkiv. That is the part of Ukraine that is traditionally Russian-speaking versus the western part of Ukraine, which is Ukrainian-speaking. And then many of us remember on the 17th of July 2014 is when we saw the Malaysian passenger aircraft that was shot down by a surface-to-air missile over that portion of eastern Ukraine. All right, this picture might look very familiar, and this was what became to be known as the Little Green Men. So these are the guys who appeared on the Crimean Peninsula, and we really didn't know who they were. They didn't wear patches, so we didn't know was it a Ukrainian soldier who forgot to properly do up his uniform. We didn't know if they were lost Russian soldiers. if they were upset Crimeans. We didn't know who these were. And that was very much by design. They took their post outside of government buildings, were rather intimidating to the locals, and eventually there was an election, referendum that was held, and of questionable fairness and integrity, and Crimea chose to secede from Ukraine and associate itself with Russia. You know, and we've got a new vocabulary because we haven't seen a lot of this stuff before. One of those words is called hybrid warfare, and it's not tanks rolling over the border, it's not airplanes flying over the border, but it might be, like we said, those little green men. It might be planning stories in the local news media that confuse people. It might be interfering with the local stock market or the economy. It could be cyber warfare. It could be hacking, an unknown person hacking into a government's computer system to create confusion. And some of our leaders, such as General Gorentz, who is the commander of the U.S. Air Forces in Europe, calls this ambiguous warfare. Ambiguous because we don't know who it is and we don't know what the source is. And this is a great concern to a lot of the governments in Europe right now. Another term is Novorossiya, a Russian term, which means New Russia. And the Putin government takes this to mean any place where Russian speakers live. Now, when the Soviet Union collapsed and Russia, and we had all the former Soviet republics, a lot of Russians ended up outside of Russia proper, in places, in countries with different names. That includes Estonia, Latvia in the Baltic countries, includes a lot of the Central Asia republics, Kazakhstan, Tartarstan, and those countries. And there's a view by the Putin government that Russia has a responsibility to those people. A lot of those governments are very concerned that responsibility to those people involves sending Russian troops to those countries. So that creates a great concern. This September, I had the opportunity to go to a conference in Brussels and spend some time at NATO headquarters and then at Mons at Supreme Headquarters Allied Powers Europe. And a couple of new terms that I heard that really I thought were relegated to the history book, and one of those were senior leaders discussing NATO's eastern flank. Something that we really think of as a Cold War term, but really coming back and really talking about an area of concern for NATO defense leaders. Another one is the Suwalki Gap. Now, who remembers the Fulda Gap, right? So the Suwalki Gap, and we'll be able to see it on a map here coming up, but it's basically an area of land that is Polish land and Lithuanian land in between the Kaliningrad, which is a separate, kind of a little island of Russia, surrounded by Lithuania and Poland, and Belarus. And that's a concern that a vulnerability for NATO, that Russian troops could go through Belarus, go towards the Baltic, and cut off NATO supply lines to the Baltic states. And finally, we already talked about those little green men. Okay, just a little graph, and I know most folks probably can't see this, so I'll just talk through it a little bit. This just shows our NATO member nations. Yeah, we had the original, mostly Western European nations, Canada and the United States, who joined as part of the Washington Treaty in 1949. 52, Greece and Turkey, Germany in 1955, Spain in 82. We had our first post-Warsaw Pact nations joining in 99, those being Hungary, Poland, and the Czech Republic. And then in 2004, a large group, Bulgaria, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, Romania, Slovakia, Slovenia. 2009, Albania and Croatia. and there's a question mark there. There's several countries that are under consideration, including Montenegro, Macedonia, and there's always debate over whether Ukraine should someday be offered NATO membership. All right, so here's a map that shows that succession, the original countries here being in black, and then some of the newer countries here. Just to point out on here, so you got your 3 Baltic countries, Lithuania, Latvia, Estonia up here, Poland, and then this is that part that we call Kaliningrad, which is actually Russian territory that is separate from Russia proper up here. Again, a larger map that shows a little bit more of Europe, and this being the Crimean Peninsula. So what our concern there is this is the Black Sea. This is all Russian territory right here. NATO member Turkey, NATO member Romania, NATO member Bulgaria, NATO member Greece. So that gives the Russian fleet, which was already stationed there, but gives Russia the opportunity to station more strategic bombers and more equipment there in Crimea that is in very close proximity to a lot of NATO member countries. Oops. Okay, let's look quickly at the Baltic countries. Again, these countries were part of the Soviet Union. They were Soviet republics up through the 1980s, up through 1990, and then each established their own. But they share a large border with Russia here, and there's not a lot of depth. If someone comes over the border, there's not a very defensible area to fall back on to repel an attack. So you can kind of see where this is an issue for NATO. And again, you see Kaliningrad down here, which is Russian territory. So that's some would describe that as a big tank parking lot. It's a big port for the Russian Baltic fleet, and as well as a lot of submarines and aircraft in that area. Okay. I imagine a number of folks in this room were probably spent some time in Europe during their military service. We used to have a lot more folks in Germany, right? We don't have a huge presence anymore. Since 1989, U.S. Air Force in Europe has decreased by 75% on all measures, whether it's people, budget, aircraft, bases. So there's not a lot left. There's only 217 aircraft, 6 main operating bases, and 34,000 airmen there. And they're not only committed to Europe, they're also committed to fully integrated in the Air Force's global commitments, whether those be Afghanistan, the Middle East, and they're also responsible for Africa. And as you can imagine, Africa, take the United States and stack the United States 3 on top of each other. And that's the distance that you get from north to south. So a big demand for anytime you're going to do something in Africa, a big demand for airlift for those C-130s or C-17s to support those operations. What we've done is turned a lot to rotational forces. Again, we don't have those permanent folks there living in Germany, England, Turkey, Italy anymore. So a lot of that has come to rotational forces coming for short-term deployments from the U.S. And those could be both active forces and Guard and Reserve forces, going from any deployments anywhere from 1 week to 4 months to 6 months of augmenting. We've seen that over the past couple years where most recently the A-10 unit from Davis-Monthan Air Force Base in Tucson completed deployment, and they spent their 6 months there hopscotching around Europe to different bases in different countries, supporting exercises, integrating with both U.S. forces and our NATO partner nations. One great one that I'm a big fan of is the State Partnership Program. This was begun in the early 1990s when we were looking to engage with all these countries that used to be in the Warsaw Pact, but now we're saying, hey, we want Americans to come in, and we want to learn from you, and we want to come closer to you, and we want to partner with you, and hopefully someday we want to join you in NATO. The National Guard Bureau, Congress created this program, gave it to the National Guard Bureau, and individual states are partnered with individual countries. This is a great mission for the Guard because of the longevity of folks. You know, if you gave this to an active duty unit, that country might see an individual once or twice during their time that they're at that base. But because of the longevity of folks in our National Guard units, they're able to build those long-term relationships and say, hey, I'll be back here next year, and we're going to do another one-week exchange where we're going to talk about different tactics. We're going to talk about how we maintain airplanes, or how we drive tanks, or how we integrate, do civil support to the local Ministry of Interior or police departments. So that is a great program, and a lot of time they've been able to partner states that have a population of speakers from that country or from that culture. So, for instance, when I was in Warsaw, our state partner was the state of Illinois. So Chicago having a very large Polish population, very good fit, and we were able to get native speakers in many cases when we needed to support training operations. Another tool is foreign military sales and training. It's a lot easier for us to talk the same language and to interoperate when we use the same equipment or similar equipment. So it's very easy for us to go and interoperate with folks when they're flying F-16s, because a lot of time they've gone to training in the United States, they've learned to fly the airplane, and they fly using our tactics. So that's one thing that right now Poland flies the F-16, Romania is in the process of receiving F-16s. They're receiving refurbished F-16s that were formerly flew with the Portuguese Air Force, and they're being refurbished, and they're going to be flying those. So that's going to increase our opportunities to be able to train with them and talk with them on the same systems and use the same terminology, which helps quite a bit. Another resource that U.S. European Command has is the European Reassurance Initiative, ERI. This is up to $1 billion that was approved to support these kind of operations, to support that deployment of A-10s, to support the deployment of F-22s, which we did for the first time this past August to Europe. To support those different exchanges and to also improve some of the infrastructure, whether that be resurfacing a runway at some of these locations or building some small infrastructure adjustments in facilities. All right, here's one unique thing. You know, we're not going to build. I don't think we're going to build any more Ramsteins or Avianos or Spangdalams or Bitburgs to the east. They're expensive. The money's not there, and the force structure's not there. Remember, we said there's 75% less, so there's not a lot to go around. One of the innovative things that we've done over the past couple of years was this Aviation Detachment, and this is a Łask Air Base in Poland. It's basically if you shot a dart right in the middle of the country, you'd hit Łask Air Base. This was activated in November 2012, and all it is 10 airmen. a lieutenant colonel, a major, a couple of senior NCOs, and some young staff sergeants. And they're there on 1-year short tours. And they are basically there to plan for and receive forces. So they will receive rotational forces at this Polish base. They live downtown. They have their offices on the base. But they will be able to, they maintain some aerospace ground equipment and have a contracting person with them to maintain the contracts that they need for fuel, for water, for hotel lodging. And they're able to receive forces for exercises. And because they were there, in March of 2014, we were able to send the Triple Nickel from Aviano Air Base with, I believe, a 12 ship or 16 ship of F-16s on very short notice after that Crimea invasion up to Poland to reassure the Poles and the Baltic countries that there was a U.S. presence on the ground there. Okay, and just wanted to show you the map here. And like I said, right there, right in the middle of the country is where that aviation detachment is. Again, Ukraine being over here, Belarus over here. Okay, another thing that's going on is Baltic Air Policing. Obviously, when Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania left the Soviet sphere, they didn't have their own air force. And they're pretty small countries, and air forces are expensive to buy and to keep well trained. So NATO has a commitment to defend the airspace. So typically NATO will have 4 aircraft in Lithuania that will be doing that air defense mission, basically sitting a lot of ground alert or doing some air patrols. And this was significantly beefed up in response to a lot of the Russian incursions, a lot more Russian bears flying long-range patrols that needed intercepting. And again, a lot of the stuff that we thought had gone the way of the Cold War that came back to us. Okay. Another thing we're doing is pooling resources. It's trying to encourage a lot of our NATO partners. Does every NATO army need to be able to do everything? Probably not. It's probably not the most efficient way to do things. So NATO has its own fleet of AWACS, aerial surveillance and air control aircraft at Geilenkirchen Air Base in Germany, and it's basically a pool of aircraft and pool of air crews. So you could have a American pilot and a German navigator and a Belgian crew commander sitting in the back. And they are taskable by NATO. Another thing is NATO AGS, Air Ground Surveillance, and that is another NATO program where a group of nations have gone together and gone to Northrop Grumman and bought Global Hawk unmanned surveillance aircraft, and they're going to operate those out of Sigonella Air Base in Italy, and they're going to provide that information to NATO and to those member nations. Again, an expensive resource that can be shared among those nations. And finally is the heavy airlift wing, and this is at Papa Air Base in Hungary. And this is 12 nations, some of those NATO nations, a couple of them, some of the Scandinavian nations, Sweden, Finland, who are not NATO members, but they basically bought 3 C-17 aircraft from Boeing, and they share ours on those. So it's kind of the NetJets corporate timeshare type arrangement for a C-17 type aircraft. And again, as this photo shows, they can fly with a Polish pilot and a Swedish co-pilot and navigator and loadmasters from 3 or 4 different countries in the back, transporting cargo. Okay, that brings us to the future. Force structure is a big issue. BRAC in the U.S., the Base Realignment Closure Commission that has happened periodically since the end of the Cold War, is a very emotional issue. Anytime it comes to the future of a base, And the bottom line is that European bases don't have a congressional delegation to defend them and support them. So a lot of times the pressure is to bring forces back from Europe rather than close, consolidate bases back here at home. So what will that look like in the future? I don't know. There is a plan to place 2 squadrons of F-35s at Lakenheath Air Base in the UK. That would be the first overseas placement of the Joint Strike Fighter. But beyond that, very uncertain on what the future is going to look like. Obviously, Europe is valued for us. We saw the value of Ramstein Air Base when we were moving cargo back and forth to Iraq and Afghanistan, and having that stop-off point to be able to forward base folks. We're seeing right now, obviously the past couple of weeks, we saw what happened in Paris, and we've seen what has been happening on the borders of Europe. So we've seen the threats not only from outside of Europe's borders, but also from within. And that's creating a lot of stress. A lot of people in Europe have grown very comfortable and used to the Schengen zone, where if any of us could fly into the airport in Frankfurt and we get a stamp and we could rent a car and we could drive down to Italy, we could drive to France and not pass a border checkpoint. That's been a great thing to bring Europe together. You've got a lot of retired British folks that live on the southern coast of Spain, and you've got a lot of students who study at different universities across Europe. And it's going to be interesting to see how the Europeans maintain that going forward with an unsecure border on the outside. North Africa and the instability there is another issue. You look at the instability in Libya, and again, refugees fleeing Libya, fleeing Eritrea, and really overwhelming some of the islands off of Italy. And that's another big issue for both the European Union and for NATO. And coming up, we have, in 2014, we had the NATO summit in Wales, and there were a lot of decisions and a lot of promises made there to relook at defense plans, to look at some of the basing. And the next summit is going to be in Warsaw in 2016. So that's going to be the next time that the NATO heads of state are going to get together and discuss a lot of these issues, discuss the progress that they've done in looking at NATO's war plans, looking at some of the on-call high readiness joint task force that have been put in place since then to be able to respond, so that if those folks do come over the border in the Baltic, that we are able to shift forces from Western Europe to respond there. And it's just a quote, and I'll read it. General Breedlove, who's the Supreme Allied Commander of Europe, understands the role air power and its inherent speed and flexibility capabilities provide to reassure our allies and deter aggression. Again, it's very difficult. We don't have many ground forces to be able to move around Europe, and it takes a heck of a lot of C-5s and a lot of ships to move a division over to Europe. But we are fortunately able to move a squadron of aircraft and have them on the ground to be a deterrence in the short run until we're able to do that. So that's what I see going forward, and I'd be happy to answer any questions that anyone might have.
Let me get the other speaker. Oh, I've got another one there. Okay, Dr. Gill, what's the question? Stand up, please.
Earlier you referenced that the U.S. sells assets to these different countries. Is the technology in those assets the same as currently what the U.S. has?
Hello.
What I'm thinking is you
Hold
don't
on one
want to
second.
sell your best cow.
Here, would you just repeat that? I got it working. Heather, you can stay in your office.
Earlier you referenced that the U.S. sells assets in these different countries. Is that the same technology that the U.S. has? I guess what I'm asking or saying, you don't want to sell your best cow.
Sure, and we've each one of those sales undergoes a technology review at DoD, and I don't want to say the exact name because I'll probably get it wrong, but it's the defense policy on technology transfer that reviews those. Obviously, we never exported any F-22s through foreign military sales. There's a pretty good reason why we didn't do that. And some programs will have limitations on them for different countries, and some of them will have, airplane might have a box in it that has a tamper seal that can't be opened, that has to be removed and shipped back to the U.S. in some cases. So there's both software and physical things that we do. We also do something called end-use monitoring. I have had the opportunity to do this, and this is going out and counting night vision goggles and saying, hey, you were sold 100 night vision goggles, let's see them. And going counting and verifying serial numbers. We also do that with some of our air-to-air missiles, AMRAAMs, and Sidewinders as well.
Yes, let me come back here.
About 3 in the back there.
Thank you. As I recall, the definition of a spy, but did the not Geneva Convention, I guess. Anyway, that it was somebody who was in a country, no identification of any kind. You were just doing what spies do. And we see these little green men coming into that area of the world and maybe other places. Trucks are not marked, they're not marked, no rank. Why wasn't something in the world raised to the concept that these were spies and could be shot on the spot? As the Geneva Convention, I think, says a spy has no right to a trial.
The defense requires vigilance, and defense requires training. Ukraine's military and security forces really languished. They were a hollow force with a lot of airplanes that didn't turn wheels because it was, well, we don't have, they had a lot of pilots who might have been lucky if they got 50 flying hours per year. Tanks that didn't have fuel to run. So really, they didn't have an effective defense against these folks coming in. Also, their security services were, as far as we know, pretty well penetrated by the Russian security services as well.
Right up to my mouth. Is that okay? With the all the NATO countries, there's a paucity of funding for the military, so there's been a drawdown in the military. Now we see the necessity for having something we don't have. Has there been any consideration to opening back up the A-10 line, or putting more attack helicopters, making them available in Europe, so when people do start running across the borders, we have those kind of assets?
So what we've seen, the latest National Defense Authorization Act, I don't think, my read of it is you're probably not going to see the A-10 retired for the next 3 to 4 years, just judging by both the climate in Congress and the current world situation. So those aircraft are going to be available. As far as putting more stuff in Europe, one thing that we've done is called the European Activity Set, is actually pre-positioning more equipment in Europe. So even though we don't have the troops to man those aircraft, man those tanks and Bradleys and trucks and Humvees, putting those in houses, preserving them, having a local staff that will make sure that they're serviceable, So if it comes to pass, you load up those forces on airliners, drop them in, and staff a few battalions or brigades to be able to do that. Somewhat reminiscent of the Reforger exercises of the 1980s, where the C-5s dropped in and the reinforcements arrived in Europe.
The program you talked about, state partnership with countries, is that Air Force only, or is that all services?
No, that's all services, and actually a lot more active on the Army National Guard side than the Air National Guard side. Obviously, it's much easier to bring a small team of Army National Guardsmen in than it is to bring aircraft in, get a tanker and bring their equipment over. So a lot of work that I saw done with that. They also have been able in recent years, a lot of the Central and Eastern European armies, the concept of assistance to civil authorities wasn't there. You know, the National Guard bumper sticker commercial that you see with flood relief, forest fire relief, that concept really wasn't there in their military, and that's one thing that the Army National Guard has been able to do very well with the state partnership program is break down some of those stigmas of the Army, the local Army forces leaving their barracks and coming out in the community and saying, hey, this is how we do it, and it's accepted and it works. And the difference between state civil status and federal status. So that's been one of the big projects that has come out of the state partnership program.
Yes, one more, and then I know that that you will stay for a little while, the Major will stay, and you're welcome to ask questions and this sort of thing. So let's take one more question, and then, you know, feel free to come on up when the program's over.
Thank you. With the scaling back of hard sites and hardware, is there a corresponding increase in drones or other aspects of surveillance?
Every combatant commander out there wants their own fleet of Reapers or Global Hawks. There's an insatiable demand for it because everyone wants to. We've gotten used to that. We've gotten used to having that television screen there with the Predator feed, keeping an eye on this person or that person or this site. So you've seen some of that with talked about the NATO AGS system at Sigonella, pooling some of the Global Hawk assets, and we'll probably see more of that. We have seen some foreign military sales of Reapers to the UK, to Spain, and I believe to Italy, and that is definitely a growth industry out there, both for U.S. industry to build and export, as well as in each of those countries who wants to have their own drone force. Good question.
Good question. One we all have about drones. Well, I think we are so fortunate here at Kilroy to have men like the Major come here and share the real information about what's happening and what's going on, rather than just reading about it in the newspaper. We're very grateful to you. If there are other things that you'd like me to perhaps present to him about things we'd like to learn about, and if it isn't something that he has time to come down and share that someone at the base could, then please let me know. Either email me or let me know, because we are really have a great relationship with Mountain Home and with the Major, and I'm sure that they'd like to be able to help us learn whatever we want to learn about in today's war. It's so different from the 1940s and the 1950s, and certainly the 70s and 80s, and this is where we're going in the future, so we'll learn as much as we can. I want to thank you so much, sir, for being here. It's just an honor to have you spend this time with us. And I'd like to give you this as a gift from the Warhawk Air Museum, and this represents everybody here, so thank you, sir. You're welcome. Okay, thank you. One other thing before you all leave, I want to tell you 2016, we've got some pretty interesting things coming up as far as speakers. Ted Thompson has agreed to make a presentation once again about the the MiG-21, which he actually flew. He's one of the few pilots in our country that did. And we're also talking with Bob Kricka, who was one of the crew members on the USS Pueblo, which was captured during the Korean War. He has agreed to come here and talk with us about that capture and the year as a prisoner of the North Koreans. And we have several other things coming up, pretty interesting. So grab a calendar and put it on your refrigerator, and have a great Christmas season and a happy New Year, since I won't see you until January. And come on up if you want to talk to the Major. He's right here.